And this takes us to our final section, where I will discuss a couple of fairly recent United States poets. Here is another version of that same scene from Orlando Furioso. This is a French painting, by the way, but it gives us a more humorous portrayal of this scene. And this painting, which is obviously a version of a famous story from Orlando Furioso, this is alluded to at the beginning of John Ashbery's poem, Soonest Mended. Barely tolerated, living on the margin in our technological society, we are always having to be rescued on the brink of destruction, like heroes in Orlando Furioso, before it was time to start all over again. There would be thunder in the bushes, a rustling of coils, and Angelica in the Angla painting was considering the colorful but small monster near her toe, as though wondering whether forgetting the whole thing might not, in the end, be the only solution. But probably the most important influence of Italian Renaissance culture on Ashbery would be his poem, Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, which I don't think it's his best poem, but it might be his most famous poem. And the poem won, I think, 3 very important awards in the year that it was published. So it was a very important moment in Ashbery's career. It made Ashbery, who was before that a rather obscure poet, and made him into what many would consider to be the great American poet of the late 20th century. And it takes its inspiration from this portrait by the Italian late Renaissance painter Parmigianino. And this is Parmigianino's self-portrait in a convex mirror. Because it's a convex mirror, it kind of distorts the image. So the hand is enormous relative to the face. And Ashbery made a whole long poem out of his meditations on this self-portrait. So it's Ashbery's self-portrait, but it's also his portrait of a portrait. It's Ashbery writing about himself, but at the same time he's writing about Parmigianino's painterly self-portrait. So whereas Pater was giving us a kind of description or reimagination of a painting, Ashbery is complicating things by giving us a reimagining of a painting, which is at the same time a kind of reimagining of his own self. And it gets quite complicated, as you could imagine. Both Pater's poem and Ashbery's poem are examples of what you might call ekphrasis, which is a kind of literary description of a visual artwork. But here's some excerpts from the beginning of Ashbery's self-portrait in the convex mirror. As Parmigianino did it, the right hand bigger than the head, thrust at the viewer and swerving easily away, as though to protect what it advertises. The time of day or the density of the light adhering to the face keeps it lively and intact in the recurring wave of arrival. The soul establishes itself. But how far can it swim out for the eyes and still return safely to its nest? So he's looking at the painting, imagining, a kind of communication between the painter, Parmigianino's soul, and Ashbery's soul. But then there's a question of, is he really seeing Parmigianino's soul? Is that really possible? How far can one express oneself? How far can one's soul venture out from oneself into this external artifact, be it a painting or be it a poem on the page? And it's also at the same time Ashbery's communication with the reader in an effort to reach out to the reader, but maybe with some skepticism about how much that is actually viable as a poetic procedure. And the last example I'll talk about is a poem published in the early 21st century by the poet Frank Bidart. It's called The Third Hour of the Night. Now, Bidart, over the series of decades, wrote a series of poems called The Hours of the Night. There's the first hour of the night, the second hour of the night, and so on. And each one is devoted to a different character. Basically, Bidart is most famous as a kind of reinventor of the poetic genre of the dramatic monologue, in which a fictional or historical character tells a story about him or herself. The most famous practitioner of this form is Robert Browning, the 19th century English poet, who also wrote a lot about Italian culture in his poetry, as you may know from your own reading. But the third hour of the night, which was published in Poetry Magazine, which is the most famous United States poetry magazine, and in fact, the whole magazine, the whole issue was devoted to just Bidart's poem. So it was a kind of big event, an unusual event in American poetry. The third hour of the night is about, well, it's a dramatic monologue, mostly a dramatic monologue, and the speaker is the Italian Renaissance sculptor Benvenuto Bellini. And here he is speaking. When my wife, this is not the most pleasant poem in the world. Actually, it's quite shocking and grotesque in some ways, but it's also rather long. You can read it for free online. I provide the link later on. But it gives you a sense of how a 21st century poet might use this material. Although, to be honest with you, it seems to me that the viability of the Italian Renaissance has been on the wane probably since Byron, and that fewer and fewer poets take much interest in this material. And I suspect that's also true of novelists and dramatists. So I'm not sure this is the most exciting cultural tradition. Frankly, it'd be more interesting to see, modern English language poets writing about Korean culture or Chinese culture or African culture. I mean, that would be more, at least novel and more, to me anyway, exciting than seeing people, meditate on the Mona Lisa. So it seems like this material is running out of its relevance, but who knows? Maybe we'll be surprised and some poets will find new things to say about it. One tendency you see is that as the poets go on, they tend to talk about more obscure characters, right? So instead of talking about Raphael, Michelangelo, they end up talking about less well-known figures like Benvenuto or Uccello and Parmigianino. But maybe there are other obscure or less well-known Italian Renaissance painters and artists whose work might be the basis for interesting literary texts in English. But I'll read a little bit of Bidart. When my wife, dead now 10 years, pulls a dress over her petticoats and hair, the air crackles. Her hair rising, tangles in ecstasy. We are electric ghosts. Because Benvenuto in my native tongue means welcome, right, here lies an artist who did not recoil from residence on earth, but, truly named, welcomed it. But I misspoke, not wife, servant, model, mother of my child, also now dead. So in the poem, he tells the story of his life. And Bidart gets most of his information from Benvenuto's autobiography, which I have not read, but I've been told it's one of the most interesting autobiographies in the history of autobiographies. So Benvenuto was a great sculptor, but he was also apparently a wonderful writer. And so you might take a look at his autobiography. So just as, say, Chaucer was adapting Boccaccio and Dante and, well, particularly Boccaccio's texts. Someone like Bedart is basically rewriting a text by the Italian sculptor Benvenuto. So Cellini, not Bellini. Benvenuto Cellini, and this is probably his most famous sculpture of Perseus with the head of Medusa. So the Greek hero Perseus cut off Medusa's head. This statue is in Firenze. So if you actually go to Firenze this June, I hope you're able to see it. And that brings us, surprisingly, to a somewhat punctual end for this lecture. Here are the sources I used.